How you doing, students out there in coronavirus land? Anyway, here's your not ready for prime time professor, presenting you the first of a couple of homemade videos to supplement the course material. So anyway, Orozco here, and basically going to be talking to you today about the argument types, which are in chapter 7. This is my version of the booklet. Yours looks a little different. But I'm going to be talking about chapter 7 and the 5 argument types. So whether you've read the chapter or not, it's about 8 or 9 pages long, and it basically has the 5 argument types. And the first part of the semester, we were talking about the kind of like the rational process that's embedded in our brains that Aristotle detected 300 or 400 years before the time of Jesus of Nazareth, and it produced the beginning of the whole field of logic all the way through the 21st century. But his insights are still pretty valid in terms of how the brain constructs arguments. And I was using that example of my son when we were watching The Lion King, and he came up with a series of observations, and he said, if this thing is mortal and this thing is mortal, and it dies, then my father is mortal, so he one day will die. So my son kind of implicitly constructed a syllogism. And so for the last 7 weeks or so, we were just looking at how people come up with syllogisms in their brain, whether that's dealing with race or whether it's dealing with some other kind of issue. We were talking about Confederate statues, we were talking about Palestine, and there's hundreds of social issues: climate change, gun control, the prison system, the education system. People will make arguments about SATs scores and whether SATs are very good what assessments of people's intelligence. And so some people will say assessments, if we wanted to use a major premise, we might say assessments that fail to incorporate cultural learning are inadequate. Second line of the syllogism would be SATs fail to incorporate cultural understanding. And the conclusion of that would be SATs are limited assessments, or whatever. I kind of lost the train. But you get the point that whether we're talking about SAT scores or we're talking about global warming or climate change or gun control or any other social issue, we were talking about Columbus, there's some kind of syllogism that people have in their brain. That's 7 weeks of the class, and you took a test, and most of you did pretty well on the 10 questions that I asked on the syllogism. So, and you've given your scores. Now we're going to be moving into the kinds of arguments that we use when we normally speak. We're not kind of looking at the X-ray. If you think about the syllogism, it's kind of an X-ray. It's kind of like, let's look below the skin and see the bones, literally the bones of the argument. I hope you can see that image. We're not looking at the X-ray of an argument, like the structure of the argument from the major premise. Now we're going to go back to look at arguments the way they normally look in print, when we're talking about a book or an article or online or in a movie or a TED Talks. We're just looking at regular arguments now. And typically when people make an argument about gun control or climate change or abortion or the need to have affirmative action, so that minorities can have more access to college admissions or to job opportunities. So whatever kind of argument we're talking about, the arguments generally fall into 5 different types of arguments. And so I've kind of created, this is just, like I said, this is home videos, man. Nothing fancy in coronavirus world. So I'm hoping that you can see that, and I'll give this to you online, but I'm hoping you can see that we're talking about 5 argument types. And the first one I want to talk about right here, maybe I should talk about this way, is cause and effect argument. And I can show you what it says there. And you can stop this video, obviously, with your pause button. But it basically, so if you're taking notes or whatever, here's the first argument type in chapter 7. This is a cause and effect argument, and this is called a causal argument. So this is when, let me try to do it this way, sorry. Yeah, this is where I need an editing button. This is when an author or a speaker attempts to demonstrate that X cause produces Y effect. So smoking meth produces meth mouth. I don't know if you can see that wonderful picture of somebody's meth mouth. So if you're talking about a cause and effect argument, you're saying smoking meth is going to produce this kind of dental, damage to your, obviously to your teeth. You can see that the author is basically saying X will cause Y. If we were taking this away from drug use, we could talk about climate change. And if we continue to burn fossil fuels meaning gasoline and things that come out of the ground like coal or natural gas. Actually, natural gas is pretty clean, but gasoline or oil, if we keep burning fossil fuels, it's going to get trapped in the atmosphere, and that's X. Burning of fossil fuels, X, will cause Y effect, trapped heat in the atmosphere, and that will produce climate change or certainly global warming. So X causes Y. That's a typical kind of argument attempt, and that's the first one I'm talking about here. So it basically says, also known, this is when an author or speaker attempts to demonstrate that X cause produces Y effect. So let me move on here for a minute. That's what I need to do. So the second type of argument type is called analogy argument. Analogy. So this is a different kind of argument attempt. This is when an author or speaker attempts to use a familiar situation or story in order to explain something. So in other words, scenario A is like scenario B, and the one that I kind of thought of back from the 80s is this one here, where you're basically, I hope you can see that that's kind of like a frying pan. It says, this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. And it says basically any questions. So it basically is saying scenario A using drugs is like scenario B, frying your brain as if it was an egg in a frying pan. So let me put this down for a minute. So in an analogy argument, as opposed to a cause and effect argument, you're saying that if you continue to do this policy, you're going to get this Y effect. X is going to cause Y. That's cause and effect argument. But in an analogy argument, you're trying to say, well, let me put it to you this way. If you continue to use drugs, that would be like putting your brain in a frying pan. So you're basically trying to use a situation that people know, which is cooking an egg in a frying pan, and showing you that if you can understand that situation, you'll be able to understand what drug use does to your brain. So it's an analogy. You're trying to compare something. Something that I mentioned in the book would be up in the Bay Area where I'm from, kind of like what Mammoth or Big Bear would be to you guys down here in the South. The ski resorts. So up in the Bay Area, when people want to get up to the snow, they go up to Lake Tahoe. And Lake Tahoe has a lot of development around that very beautiful lake. A lot of development. It means that fertilizer, when people use fertilizer on golf courses and on their lawns, it eventually gets into the gutter. And in the gutter, it makes its way down into the streams and then gets into the Lake Tahoe. So Lake Tahoe is having what they were calling algae blooms. So if you went into Lake Tahoe, you could get your little canoe or get your boat or your kayak, and you could get out there, and you notice that the first 10 or 15 feet of the lake, before it got really clean and blue, the first 10 or 15 feet of the lake was full of pond scum, like algae, real thick, heavy green stuff. And basically the experts were saying was that all the fertilizer that people use on their lawns eventually was going washing into the lake, and it was producing, well, whatever can grow on land can also grow in water. So if you're fertilizing plants on or lawns on land, that can also fertilize stuff to grow in water. So they were saying that, well, it's kind of like a cause and effect argument that, a lot of fertilizer use is creating a lot of algae blooms in Lake Tahoe. But the analogy argument came in when the Sierra Club asked, I think it was George Bush back in the day, basically said, hey, can you give us some money to remediate all the problems in Lake Tahoe? The Bush administration gave like $1 million. $1 million. I mean, and $1 million is great, but not when you're talking about a lake as big as Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is huge. If you stand on the side of the lake, it looks like an ocean. You can't even see the other side of the lake. It's so big. So $1 million is not going to really do that much. And somebody from the Sierra Club said, the $1 million that George Bush has given us for remediating Lake Tahoe is like putting out a 5-alarm fire with a garden hose. So I'm hoping you can kind of see the use of, I think her name was Carol Pope, the head of, I think, Sierra Club or something, Environmental Protection League, or the Defense League, Environmental Defense League, something like that. Anyway, Carol Pope said that the $1 million that George Bush had given to the Sierra Club was like trying to put out a 5-alarm fire with a garden hose. In other words, you can see that, man, you got a 5-alarm fire blazing. You're not going to be able to put it out with a garden hose. There's just not enough water on the situation. So the scenario of the garden hose illustrates the dire problem of the need for more money for the Lake Tahoe situation. I'm hoping you can see that the author, Carol Pope, used an analogy so that we could like mentally make an image. Okay, so that's the second one. Third one would be contradiction argument. Ooh, let me see this kind of backward as I look at the screen. Contradiction argument. This is when an author or a speaker attempts to demonstrate the irrational or the irrationality or contradictory nature of some policy or idea. So that sounds wordy. So let me put it this way. A mass shooting at a school occurs, and President Donald Trump suggests that teachers should be armed in school. Some political commentator, upon learning this, puts out the following tweet in order to point out the contradictory or irrational suggestion. That's what contradictory argument does. You try to use an argument to point out how irrational or contradictory a certain policy or an idea is. So basically, here's what the person said. Arming teachers in the classroom will not make students safer. In fact, it will make classrooms more dangerous, since teachers will not be sufficiently trained in the use of firearms, nor will they have the mental abilities to know when a situation requires the use of force. And I don't know if you can see the cartoon there, but it basically says something like, ooh, let me see if I can get that right up to the camera. Basically, it says on the pistol, it says Florida stand your ground arms. And I think it basically says, how did I know that person's Skittles wasn't like an armed weapon? I can't read it so well because it's upside down, but anyway. In other words, you could have teachers easily misinterpret a loud student, let's say a hyperactive student. Let's just say some fidgety student's always getting up, and especially in grammar school or in middle school, and some teachers saying, man, that kid is a little out of control. And, people, can misinterpret signs and stuff and feel like, they're being threatened. Now you've got a gun in the classroom. I mean, I don't know, but it's easy for use of force to kind of take place in something like that. Even if a teacher is having a problematic student, if they don't have a weapon, what are they going to basically do against a student? Get mad at them, expel them, send them to the principal's office. But if you have a weapon, who's to say, the teacher's going through a hard time, going through divorce, going through financial problems and stuff like that. Now some kid is getting mouthy with them and stuff like that, and the teacher has a weapon. I don't know, it's hard to say if that would be. So anyway, in a contradiction argument, somebody listens to an argument and then responds to it and says, man, this is irrational. And you try to point out how irrational the argument is. And I'll give you one other last example of it. Would be like you have two parents, and one of the parents says to another parent, hey, we have to stop entitling our daughter, with giving her money now that she's a college age student. We just can't give her money all the time for all her situations. She's got to become independent. And so the daughter comes to the father and says, "Hey, Dad, I need tires this month. I just don't have the money." And the father kind of breaks down and says, "Oh, you know what, man? Here's $500. Don't tell your mother." And then the mother learns about it. Well, she's going to be pissed, and she's going to go to the husband and say, "Let me point out the contradictory nature of what you just did. You're saying that you want our daughter to become independent, but then you go ahead and give her money to make her more dependent. So instead of getting independence, we're getting more dependence." So the wife there is kind of pointing out the irrational nature of the father, who basically wanted to be loving to his daughter, but in a sense, not really helping the daughter, kind of enabling the daughter in some way. So that's contradictory argument or contradiction argument. You point out the irrationality of a policy. I'll give you one last one because this one's not as clear. It doesn't make as much sense. Like, what do you mean by you point out the irrationality of an argument? So let's put it this way. We throw people in prison and we want them to learn good, adult citizen behavior, good citizen skills. But somebody looking at the prison justice, the incarceration system or the prison justice system could look at the prison justice system and say that everything that happens in a prison is duplicating all of the impacts that made a prisoner in the first place. So typically prisoners are abused. I taught in Donovan prison for a year, and that was back in the 90s, but I taught at Donovan, so I taught in a prison for a year. I had to sign in, I had a badge, I had everything. I had to go through checkpoints and everything. So I was teaching philosophy there. And one of the things that I learned in, being a teacher in prison is that 75% of prisoners have physical abuse in their background, physical abuse and sexual abuse, about 75% on both physical and sexual abuse. That's why people get kind of messed up and end up in prison. But anyway, so if somebody is looking at the prison justice system and wants to make a contradiction argument, they'll say something like, well, putting people in prison and expecting them to become normal, it's never going to happen because prison is doing exactly the opposite of what we need to do. In other words, in prison, you're getting a duplicated system of abuse and rigidity and isolation that produced the prisoner, the criminal in the first place. So we're never going to get rehabilitation on this side if we keep putting people in harsh prison situations where they're often raped, they're abused, there's drugs, they have to decide which gang to affiliate with just for personal protection. So how are those situations going to establish rehabilitation? So the prison system kind of does the opposite. So that's what a prison critic might do, is point out the contradictory nature of the prison system, or the criminal justice system, I think was what I'm trying to say. And then the last two, I'll just be kind of quick here because you don't want to be listening to long videos. Statistical argument. This is when an author or speaker attempts to use numerical data in order to support an argument or position. So I think I put there something from Pew Research. That is, sorry about this, guys. This is, like I said, I don't make videos. At the same time, gun violence, from big city murders to mass shootings, has spurred debate in Congress and state legislators over proposals to limit Americans' access to firearms. Counting murders and suicides, nearly 40,000 people died in gun-related violence in the United States in 2017. So counting murders, obviously, that's about 11 to 15,000 murders a year. But the rest of those, maybe, like shooting accidents, hunting accidents, or suicide, that makes up to about 40%. Typically, murders of the 30 to 40,000 people that die every year as a result of a gun, 30 to 40,000, just depends what year. But I've seen statistics from 29,000, 32,000. 2017 was 40,000. Of the 40,000 people that die of a weapon from a firearm every year, usually people who die as a result of a homicide, that's usually 11 to 12 to 13 to 14,000 out of that percentage, so less than half. And the rest of those deaths occur basically by firearm accidents or by suicide. Like a couple of years ago, there was 17,000 suicides in 1 year. 17,000 suicides. I mean, this incredible amount of people in a 365-day year cycle. You can do the math. How often people are killing themselves on a daily basis. So basically, statistical arguments, we use them all the time. We say this many people died in World War II, or this is how much CO2 we're pumping into the environment, and this is what the Toyota Prius will save you per gas tank, or this is how many miles you'll get per gallon. And so there's always statistical arguments that are telling us, what a product can do for us, how many more vitamins or how much energy we can feel, or how much more money you'll make if you become a real estate broker. Or statistical arguments are used all the time, and statistics lie. So, and we'll talk about that when we get into fallacies and how any one of these 5 argument types can easily drift over to becoming a fallacy. So we'll come back to that when I make another video on the fallacy presentation. So, and then the very last one, you guys got to get away from here, is that it's expert opinion. So let me see if I can have this right here. So expert opinion occurs when an author presents evidence from reputable authorities in order to win support for their position. I just typed this. Example, a prosecuting attorney brings in a fingerprint expert to identify fingerprints at the scene of a crime. Of course, there are experts in almost every field of study, from agriculture to law, from psychology to astrophysics. The use of expert opinion is an excellent way to solidify one's arguments. And you can see I have somebody, fingerprinting. So we use expert opinion all the time when we write papers. We'll say, according to this historian, the Civil War occurred because of the slavery issue that was in the country, or the World War II was caused by, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, or the American involvement in World War II. So we use expert opinion. And don't believe me, as the simple student, I'm sorting some historian in my paper that's called footnotes. And people bring in expert opinion all the time. That's what talk show hosts do all the time. They say, hey, talk to us about how you can get the coronavirus. If any of you are watching the news, you'll see that they're always bringing in this Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Anderson Cooper always brings this guy in and says, wash your hands, including your thumbs, really well, and your fingers for about a minute in warm water. And so you're getting all of that because they're bringing in experts so that they can support their opinion. So those are the 5 argument types. So you have cause and effect. You're basically showing that X causes Y. So don't smoke meth, by the way. It'll make you get coronavirus. Analogy arguments, which basically show people, hey, if you keep doing this, it looks like this. And it kind of helps people get a mental image. Oh, if I keep doing that, I'm going to get this. I can hear a mother sometimes say, maybe not using a good analogy argument, but saying, if you keep dating that dude, that'd be like jumping off the Coronado Bridge. Mom is kind of exaggerating a little bit there, kind of like, nah, Mom, I don't think he's that bad. It's not like I'm jumping off the Coronado Bridge, but you can see how Mom's trying to say A scenario is like B scenario. You keep dating this dude, that's like jumping off the bridge. That's kind of extreme, but people use extreme analogies all the time, and sometimes that can be a fallacy, as we will learn. Then there's contradiction argument. I went over that. Statistical argument, that's really typical. You use statistics all the time in your arguments. And then expert opinion. So next week, when you guys get ready to write your paper on Jordan Peterson, I sent you a link in the announcement page. You're going to write a paper on Jordan Peterson. All of that information is in the syllabus. And I sent you the link to the Jordan Peterson article. And basically what you're going to do is listen to the Jordan Peterson article, well, not article, but his brief little defense of why wages are unequal between men and women. It's kind of interesting that, anyway, but I don't want to make this a separate video. So 5 argument types, you've gotten them. I hope I didn't blow it. And you can always email me and send me a message and say, hey, Mr. Roscoe, you move your body too much, or you're too crazy, and you speak too quickly and stuff like that. Or so just let me know. Give me some feedback, okay? Be nice. Don't be so mean behind your computer screen. All right, I'm out.